Hi, my name is Eric Dewar. I'm Associate Professor of Biology at Suffolk University. I teach a course about evolution for non-science students called Humans and the Evolutionary Perspective. And I'm here today with a couple of my honors students, and we're going to talk about some article that we read about the evolution of human intelligence and like what the limits to that intelligence might be. So why don't you guys introduce yourselves first?
Hi, my name is Lily. I'm a theater and psychology major at Suffolk University.
My name is Maddie Hurley, and I'm an art history and history major at Suffolk.
All right. So the article talks, there are a few different texts that kind of started off with thinking about, is it brain size? Is it encephalization quotient? So when we're looking at encephalization quotient, that like compares how big a mammal's brain is compared to how big we would expect it to be for its body size. So like, for example, pigs and humans have pretty similar body masses overall, but our brains are really different sizes for one another. So because our brains are like larger than we might predict for its size, that ends up translating into other kinds of abilities than you'd get like in a pig. So, so what do you guys want to talk about? The things about brain size or anything like that first?
It was a very definitive article about like the brain size isn't gonna like affect the intelligence, and it got into the whole like axons and neurons and like that whole thing, which was really interesting. But one thing that I quoted and that made me think a little bit, and it was kind of out there of like, can we do this? Was when he was saying that intelligence may depend on the neural reserve and what's left over for the brains after the brain's like menial chores are accounted for. And I was wondering like, what are those like chores that it's doing, and like, can we figure out if they're necessary for the brain to be involved in? Because if we're not using that side of the brain for those little things, then like maybe we can use it for computing and other things. And like along the same lines of like, are there any things that the brain do, like the appendix of the brain, that's like kind of outdated and not really necessary for like our survival today, that like maybe our brain is doing but we don't know and we don't need it to do?
Yeah, I think when they're talking about menial tasks of the body, I think they're thinking a lot about just driving the meat. So like when you think of an animal the size of a mouse has way like fewer cells than an animal that's the size of an elephant or a whale. So you need more wires going out from the brain to be able to drive the meat. So I think, so like just like muscle control, control of like involuntary stuff like secretion of glands and those kinds of things, those have to kind of scale up as the body increases in mass. So I think that's where like the general relationship comes from. It's not like a body of this size has to have a head of a particular size, but it's like the body of a particular size has to have enough neurons to be able to run the cells. In fact, an interesting way I heard thinking about number of brain cells actually was comparing the number of what are called interneurons, which are neurons connected to other nerve cells, versus sensory or motor neurons. So like sensory neurons bring information in, motor neurons send motor commands out, but interneurons, that's the different like procedural knowledge in the brain that's going to be dinging different functions like kind of within the brain. So like the nerve cells talking to themselves, those are the ones that tend to account for most of the things that we talk about of like as being problem solving or intelligence. So the thing about humans that's really interesting is like, yes, we have a larger brain, but proportionally we have way more like nerve cells connected to other nerve cells doing thinking stuff, as opposed to just sort of controlling the body. So I think that wasn't mentioned in this article, but I think that's another kind of useful way to think about it. What else about brain size, Maddie?
So I was kind of curious. He talked about what ends up being more of a burden when your brain is larger, especially when he was comparing it to animals like elephants and whales and stuff. I was wondering what he like specifically meant by the burden of having a bigger brain. Like I know he talked about the signals taking longer to get between the neurons, but what does that like translate into overall?
It translates into metabolic energy. Like
Okay.
when you are at rest, when we're like we are now kind of sitting in a chair, your brain gets about half a liter of blood every minute sent to it. Now, when you're running the Boston Marathon, it gets that same half a liter of blood sent to you. So like, no matter what you're doing, like sleeping or awake, the brain is this, like, I think they talked about it as like this tapeworm. It's like this hungry thing inside the body that is always getting its pound of flesh no matter what you're doing. So it's a really metabolically expensive organ. So that's one thing about having a bigger brain means you got to send more energy that way in order to fuel it. And so that would end up being something that's going to be not like, it's going to be disadvantageous now. It's sort of like in our class, we had talked a little bit about the advantage of being cold-blooded versus warm-blooded. We think like the warm-blooded ones are the champs, but cold-blooded is actually a really efficient way to go. You know, most things are not endothermic like mammals are. And it's because it's a more like efficient way to run your body. So I would think about it like that. You know, so a bigger brain means you gotta fuel it. You know, sort of like if you're going from a bike to a car, the difference is you gotta put gas, you gotta put more gas in that car or more gas in a bigger car.
Yeah, I was curious too because of like everything, like because we're saying how your brain gets a certain amount of calories, and I was thinking like if with the way that Americans eat today, but like with the way that we consume today, like is there a possibility that we can use, I don't know, if that is like giving us more metabolic energy that our brain can take in, and like we're developing more either social awareness or intelligence in some other way that we're not identifying as like intelligence because we're not like progressing in some way? So that was like,
I like the idea. I don't think this is a um, kids today, like how Americans eat kind of thing. I think this because like there were some big leaps in human diet, like when we started cooking, because that was going to be because humans have been omnivores from the beginning, and meat was always like a part of the diet, but not like the part of as much of a diet as is in most Americans' diets today. But the ability to start getting high, like a lot of protein in from foods, uh, in from meat is something that was really advantageous. But the thing is, the way your digestive system works, it doesn't. Um, it's picky. It like takes the food that you bring in and breaks it down to like the simplest monomers, the simplest little Lego bits, and then turns it into other proteins later. So it has like ways to be able to switch. If your brain needs more protein, but you're eating mostly mostly kind of vegetable stuff, it will do it. There are like metabolic mechanisms that it has to be able to turn grass into protein. I mean, that's where hamburgers come from, right? So I think that I think that there are a couple of different ways to answer this. A, cooking did a lot, but B, just for getting more calories in. But B, also, the thing is, there are digestive system and other metabolic switches we have allow us to be able to do kind of a lot with a lot of different kinds of foods. So I don't think that there's been a big jump in like the kinds of diets that we have in the West, but but it'd be great if it were. It'd be great if just a better diet made you smarter. I mean, a really lousy diet can affect brain development, but that's not all we're talking about here, I think. Yeah. What else was interesting in this article for you guys?
The end of it was interesting about how he was saying we need to focus more on like a collective intelligence instead of an individual intelligence, because it made me think of like, well, we can work together, but the problem is that like I feel like emotions get in the way a lot of the time of like developing kind of a collective intelligence, because it's I want to do this, well, I want to do that. And I think that I was wondering if like I was thinking like with the development of AI or something like that, where you might not have that emotional level of like, well, I want this and I want that, like is a collective intelligence easier to come about? And also, can we as humans maybe find a way to put those emotions aside to have a collective intelligence to progress as a society instead of as individuals?
I don't know. I feel like there would always be obstacles you would run into. Just because, like, as organisms, we're so individual. Like, I know he talked about the bees and stuff, but I'm not, like, super knowledgeable about that whole thing. But I feel like they have certain mechanisms that make them able to communicate with each other that like humans don't have the equivalent of necessarily.
It's true, I didn't think about that.
Well, I mean, the question was in this particular article that we read, there are, this stuff they talk about complicated the behaviors of bees that look pretty complicated, and there are a lot of things that like the insect brain can do that are really surprising, including like I know I'm familiar with this one species of wasps that's able to like they have like males have fights with one another, and it's important to remember like who you lost to so you don't have to like have the fight again. So actually there are these like wasps that can remember faces, but this is with and that's something we talk about in humans. The social brain hypothesis is this idea that our brains got big because we need to be able to navigate these social relationships, but if a bee can do it, how complicated can it be? So I think there are a lot of questions that we can kind of throw out in that. Other stuff that we might, but about other kinds of like emotions and behavior, how that, I don't know if it's so much emotion as just sort of agreement about sharing. When we think of like in-group, out-group biases that our brain has, we're sensitive to being taken advantage of. So trying to find trying to reach collective decisions aren't always just about like emotions. The emotions come from like, am I going to get taken advantage of or not? I think where they're going with the expanded brain abilities comes more from like just writing, I mean, if you look at, there are all these kids today arguments people make, but like even like Aristotle and Socrates like complained about their students, like, well, they're writing all this stuff down instead of like memorizing all of their odes like they should have. The brain has the capacity to be able to remember lots of knowledge, but but writing it down frees up the brain to do other stuff. So, so I think it's more about being able to store information someplace, like just kind of download it someplace so it can be accessed later, but not have to have it be walking around knowledge. I don't remember everything I ever read, but if I still have the book, I can still remember. I remember I read something about it and I can find it again. I think that's where the next big jump happened. And, writing came about when, actually some of the first writing we have is it's like a receipt. So, complaints about, keeping track about early, basically remember who's getting paid for what, during early trade. So like, there's a lot of, we do that just to kind of get it out of the RAM. We only have a couple minutes left. Our time has flown, unfortunately. What else, Maddie, what else do you want to talk about?
I was really interested when he mentioned towards the end that he talks about like our brains almost having like nothing left to improve because it's like reached that like middle ground where it's like doesn't take up so much energy that it's disadvantageous to us, but at the same time like we're still like more intelligent than other animals. And I was wondering, like, can a trait completely stop evolving? Like, can it get to a point where it's impossible for it to like change one way or the other? Or
so the argument made in the book was, this was particularly about nerve cell size, because like large nerve cells are able to transmit impulses faster because they have like lower resistance. Small nerve cells can respond more quickly, but they also respond when they're not supposed to, so you get a lot more noise. So it's hard to kind of piece out like what's the important stuff. But if the question is, can any traits stop evolving? Traits that are under heavy selection, like ones like the size of our brain, because they're advantageous, but they're also super expensive. They're like on this, I mean, we talk about fitness, like adaptive peaks. Like there's some things that are really that are pretty complicated, pretty well put together. And if we try to make any little adjustments, it makes them like less good. We talked in class about the eye and how this janky backwards eye that we have is like, yeah, it's goofy, but I mean, it works well. But in order to re-evolve it, we'd have to like deconstruct a lot that would actually make the eye less effective. So I think the brain's in that kind of situation too. It's not that it can't evolve higher. It's just that when you try to turn up one lever to optimize one kind of process, you end up, decreasing the effectiveness of something else. So it's almost like a standoff, I guess. Not so much that it can't evolve better, but based on what the starting point is, because we can't with just evolution, we can't introduce new components. We can't, like if we can engineer it, that's one thing, but just using natural selection, or other kinds of selection to be able to, try to change it. Yeah, we're sort of it's like, at least right now, it looks like, we've reached kind of this dynamic equilibrium of it's pretty great, but it would be hard to make it better. Not because humans are the pinnacle of creation, but just because we've kind of like all of the different easy ways to become more efficient or become better have like already been done.
Okay.
I think Maddie wrote this, but do you think that we have to start working backwards now in order to get better? Like kind of what you're saying about how we'd have to deconstruct to make the eye better. Do we have to now like kind of revert backwards so that we can move forward and be better?
That would be, that would be great, except that evolution, like selection, isn't forward thinking. Selection is purpose driven. Selection sifts and sorts what's happening like right now. So you can't be like, well, I'm gonna deconstruct my eyes for a while, but don't worry, there's something great coming. Like that's what that's what design is. And like that's a place where, yeah, maybe we're at some kind of biochemical limit for what's possible for our nervous system, but but if we need to engineer stuff in, we have the ability to do engineering. So we're all gonna, maybe this will be the last generation of unaltered humans, whether by introducing new genes or by introducing, just hardware, I don't know. All right, well, on that dizzying note, well, thanks guys. This was fun. I think I talked too much, but it was good to see you guys. And for everybody else, thanks for watching. So say bye.
Bye.